So let us look at the course of the war in Mashonaland. Let us look at the course of the law in Mashonaland, course of the war in Mashonaland. That were the events of the war in Mashonaland. So as you look into the whole Chimurenga, the Ndebele were the first to start or to engage in the war. So the Mashonaland people later on joined the war later, like they joined the war later. That was in June 1896. They did so after harvesting their crops, right? So how the war started was quite funny. It started by the killing of whites in Mashonaland area. Yes, like I said, most of the whites, just like in the Mashonaland areas, lived in isolated locations, right? Lived in isolated locations, like they could live in this place, then this place, so it was easy for them to be attacked. So 2 Indian traders were killed by Mashonaland people who killed the native commissioner for Chegutu. So by the end of June, over 10 whites had been killed. So the whites were taken by surprise because they considered the Shona as a peaceful group. I remember when when they came here via the pioneer column, they vakatoshandisa nzira kuMashonaland. Why vanga vaineka kudheerera Mashona, vaitotya mandebele, ndosaka vakona vakavoida, but vanga vaineka kudheerera Mashona, but Mashona anga vaineka chitsotsi kanga vaina. So the whites vakatoshokwa. Yes, they were shocked because they didn't expect the Shona to react like that. So the whites responded by setting up lagers in places like Beruka, Domblawa, Yomberengwa, Mutare, Harare, and Chata. So the Shona fighters blocked the roads using trees. They used guerrilla war tactics. When I'm talking about guerrilla war tactics, it means they were like fighting in the bush, yes, like guerrilla war tactics involve like fighting in the bush, which you say. But at the same time, there's a weakness here that some Shona did not join the war, and they were too separated. Like the chiefdoms in Mashingo, Chikomba, Bohera, extreme eastern Zimbabwe, and northern Zimbabwe stayed out of the war. So there were some areas that Pisa or right, so the Shona chiefs fought the war, the whites as separate entities. I think I was explaining this to someone yesterday. That one of the reasons why we lost the first Chimurenga is because we were so disunited. And fortunately enough, we learned from our mistakes. That's why we managed to win the second Chimurenga. In the second Chimurenga, we managed to unite and fought the whites. But in the first Chimurenga, the chiefdoms were so separated. And even some Shona even fought on the side of the whites. Nyama ivatengesa inaotanga naso. Vatengesi vaito wako even second Chimurenga vaivako. So the Shona also hid in caves. The whites used the dynamite to attack the Shona in caves. The spread of Chimurenga to other areas was done through spirit mediums and fire signals. And Neanda and Kagui were important spirit mediums who encouraged the Shona to fight, especially in Mazowe and Chishawasha area. And the uprising rapidly spread to Harare, Mazowe, Chata, Maronde, Ramakonde, and other eastern districts of Zimbabwe. The settlers mounted patrols to rescue survivors and ferrying them to lagers in Harare, Mutare, and Chata. And the whites, because they were even assisted by reinforcements from South Africa. The British Imperial forces were brought in from South Africa under Lieutenant Colonel Alderson. So the Bisak forces under Alderson attacked and defeated Makoni Gwindingwi's fortress. They also defeated Mangwende Maope fortress. Defeated Shona chiefs were executed, for example, Makoni. Yes. So the whites now engaged in the Scotch Death policy. It is also an act of sabotage. They began to destroy the Shona grain stores, the homes and the water sources to starve the Shona into submission. And they even attacked and defeated Shona chiefdoms separately. That's when inspirational leaders like Neanda, she was captured and executed in April 1897. She had ordered the killing of Pollard, the native commissioner for Mazoe. So Shona resistance collapsed after the capture of their leaders like Mashonaland on July 1897, and then Kagui was inspirational, like in the area, around Guarari, October 1897. So the capture of those people are the ones who were motivating the people to fight. So when they were captured, it broke the Shona spirits and eventually brought the war to an end. So, however, there was Mapondera, Angaine Naro, he continued to fight until 1903. So, there were some areas where the first Chimurenga was fought in Mashonaland, Kunachinamora, Mashayamombe, Nemakonde, Mazoe, Chiweshe, Nyandoro, Makoni, Chiwota, Mangwende, so Shemtekeza and Mapondera. So, there were some Shona chiefs, Vakatengisa, Vanamtasa, Vanazimuto, Vanagutu, Vanamatibi, Vanachirumanzu. Right, but the Shona chiefs who fought against the whites during the first Chimurenga, they included Mashayamombe, Mangwende, Mutekeza, Mashonganyika, Nyamweda, Mapondera, Makoni, and Gunzi. And there's this list. Right, so there are heroes and heroines of the first Chimurenga. These include Umlugulu, Mukwati, Mbuya Neanda, Sekuru Kagui, Bonda, Chifamba, Chaminuka, and Noherega. So also like to look at the role played by the spirit mediums, religious leaders in the uprising. They planned and organized the uprising. They prophesied on the war and assured Africans that they would win the war. They encouraged people to fight. They advised on strategies to be used. They communicated with ancestral spirits. They commanded the soldiers. They relayed information from court and ancestors to chiefs and people. They provided medical herbs. They led at war discussions and presided over war crimes. They even coordinated the war. They mobilized the people and taught people political education. They provided spiritual guidance. They gave moral support to the fighters. And vamwe vaitona masoldiers. And vamwe vacho vaitaura vanga vaine information. Because since vanhu vaisikirwa. Vaitobva vaudza vanhu kuti muri kufana kufamba so something like that. That was one of their roles. So my chiefs again, they organized warriors, they united the people, they led the soldiers in the war, they also participated in the war. So was the extension of the uprising to 1897 a result of the effectiveness of the Shona tactics? Yes. So the Shona used the guerrilla warfare. And again, the Shona fought in small groups. It was also a blessing in this. Because my whites aita kutilene one by one. So spirit mediums coordinated the war, encouraged individual chiefs to keep on fighting. The Shona mobilized faster than the whites. The Shona had guns acquired from the Portuguese. The Shona were familiar with the terrain. They used nocturnal night attacks. The Shona fighters disguised themselves as ordinary innocent hunters. And war was not restricted to soldiers only. Munwesai were involved. And that's what happened even the second Chimurenga. Nyana, Chimbidona, Mjiba. It was not only those who had military training being responsible for fighting on the battlefront. Vanhu vese vaitorwa hondo. I've heard about even kuno kuma towns. Papa ne vanhu vaito takura kana paitwa ma act of sabotages. Muchinzi muno mune magandanga rugara kana kuno kumbari. Kuno vanhu vaitotorawo nyemba nebhinzi kubva mumamisha dzichiuya kuno kudzifida magandanga. And magandanga aipinda mumisha. Paimbwa masongs yainzi gandanga ridye mukomo. So vakasvika maitouraya mbudzi kana mombe. Vainzi vana mukoma. Vodya. So they also the weaknesses of the whites. The whites underestimated the Shona. Vakatidherera vanhu ivava vachifunga kuti pamwe tiri mabalance zvekudaro. So the whites initially had fewer troops They ended up getting reinforcements from South Africa because Mashona has put as a. And white as enemies were easily identified because of their color, and the reason why the Shona were so fixated on fighting in the what in the bush under the guerrilla warfare. It is because it was hard for them to be identified too. So whites had been stretched in terms of resources by the war in Mashonaland. So why the Shona took so long to be defeated in the 1896-1897 uprising? They had stored a lot of food in caves. The Shona chiefs fought separately in small groups and made it difficult for the whites to defeat them easily. The Shona used guerrilla warfare tactics such as night attacks, hit and run, and surprise attacks. And spirit mediums coordinated the war and encouraged the individual chiefs to keep on fighting. And Shona chiefs such as Makoni and Mangwende used the fortified mountains. Plus, Mashona I trade and Portuguese. So, Vangava know food 1 or 2. And the whites here, the terrain better than the whites. And the war in Mashonaland was not limited to professional fighters. Women were also included. Because you kana kuine hondo ukatotanga ubigira vanhu sadza utoriwo muhondo macho imo hazvirevi kuti munhu ari kurwa hondo kuridza futi chete. No, anyone who supports you while you are in war, because ndiye ari kukupa the strength to fight. So that person is also part and parcel of the war. So there were many hills in Mashonaland, and this provided cover for Shona chiefs. And however, the whites initially had fewer soldiers because some had been taken to South Africa in the Jameson raid. And again, the Bismarck had financial problems. Yes. So Bismarck even kurwakwa hondo kwakuri kanzatu and vanhu vakarohwa by surprise. And vanhu vaya vanga vakagara vakateya mandebele chete vasingazivi kuti Mashona we are not pushovers. So the whites were not prepared for war with the Shona, and they took too long to mobilize. And the resources of the whites had been outstretched due to the war in Mashonaland, and the whites were not familiar with the terrain. And would like to know why the Shona were defeated. Yes, why were the Shona defeated? The reasons were quite similar to that of the Ndebele state. The Shona lacked coordination. They had no military strategy. The Shona were not united. Some Shona fought on the side of the whites. Some Shona did not join the war. And the obvious reasons: they had inferior weapons, they had inferior training, they had poor communication, they had poor transport. The spirit mediums misled the people by telling them that bullets won't work against them. But on the other hand, there were also the strengths of the whites. The whites were strong. The whites had better transport. The whites had better organization. They had superior weapons. And the surrender of the Ndebele made the whites to concentrate on the Shona only. They used the scorched earth policy adopted by the whites, stabbed the Shona into submission. And the whites even captured inspirational leaders like Makoni, Mashayamo, Bekakuvi, and Nyanda. Those were the people who were strengthening the people. And my whites foot tortured interrogation. Vaiti kana vachitsvaga masoja magandangajai vaipinda misha vatanga kupisa imba yemisha yavanhu votanga kurowa vanhu vachitsvambura vanhu kutaura kuti mana chiefs enyu nemasoja aripi. So they could use dynamites again, kuti vaputitse macaves, and the settlers bribed some Shona to fight on their side. Right. But we also find out that the Shona were also defeated because of lack of inspiration, especially after the death of Nyanda and Kabui. These two were inspirational. They were excellent leaders in their own right. So when they were executed, they were a source of motivation and courage of the Shona. So the Shona lacked that appetite or that zeal to continue to fight. So they were leaders, hence their death resulted in lack of what? Of leadership. Ndovanga leaders actually. So kana leader akafa zvinoita personal leadership. So they were coordinators during the war, though part and parcel of them being leaders. And their death demoralized the Shona fighters. Right. So to what extent did lack of unity contribute to the defeat of the Shona? There was a lack of coordination among the Shona. Some Shona chiefs did not join the war. For example, Mutasa. Some Shona chiefs assisted the whites. They had no common military strategy. So the Shona had inferior weapons. Whites were better organized. Whites had faster transport. And again, the surrender of the Ndebele. So what were the weapons used by the whites against the Ndebele and the Shona? The dynamites, the 2.5-inch screw guns, the 7-pounder guns, the scorched earth policy, the Maxim guns, the Henry Martin rifles, the wagons, and also the horses. And there were some weapons used by the Africans. They also fortified the mountains and caves, bows and arrows, old muskets obtained from Portuguese, and spears. So let us round up this topic by looking at the results of the first Chimurenga. Right. Right. Obvious, the Africans lost their what? Their independence. They were defeated. And African traditional politics was destroyed because they also knew Papa by influence. And remember, African politics and the African intention, their African traditional religion, they are intertwined. And so that's why they destroyed them. In my inspiration, I took up chiefs in my spirit mediums. So make sure next time let's get rid of that. So Mashonaland was divided into districts, each under a native commissioner. The BISAC introduced formal government through the Rhodesia Orders of Council of 1898. The British introduced a resident commissioner to monitor the administration of the BISAC. Those who defied settler authority were substituted by collaborators. And the Ndebele could not choose a new king, and this led to the collapse of the Ndebele state. And most African leaders were either imprisoned or killed, and more reserves were created. Because my whites colonization, land history. So varungu vakavhatora land yakanaka yacho yanga iri fertile, then pavanoisa mandebele nemashona kwakashata kwakusingaibvi kwakune matombo kwekuti mamusingamborimi kana chii kwakusinganyatsi kunaya futi ndokwainzi kumareserves ndopakabva bvabva wedre kuti chii kuruzevha. So most African men worked for low wages in mines and the farms, and Africans became politically dependent on white as laborers. Because the whites were the ones who had taken over, and they had also created a monetary economy. And then you are now forced to go to Mashandra whites while my farms are on in my mines. So payment of taxes by Africans continued, and Kunji and Mapondera continued with the resistance, but they were later defeated. And at the end of the day, my missionary akapembera singaiti because politically zinzazva chinja. So they now had the social power to move on wachitendeutsa vanhu. Ndo pakabva pasimukanya mission machechi nechii papa mashona ezanga anga kutendeutswa into Christianity. And the Shonas were forbidden to build houses in mountains. Yes, because my whites anga asingadi kuti vagare mumakomo. Because vaiona sekuti makomo pakada pakaitika noise, it is not easy to defeat munhu anogara mukomo. Iwo whites in fact ukada kutarisa mapurasi mazhinji dzimba dzevarungu kwakune makomo varungu vazhinji vangokaisa anenge nezimota rake zi4x4 rinenge richikwira chipiende varungu vazhinji ndomboonana namakara even ana chimani murungu imba yemurungu dzenyu dzine dziri pasi iye yake iri mudenga. It's for defense purposes because it's hard to attack a person ari mukomo. Iye ndiye anotokuona imuchuya. So how were the settlers affected by the result of the first Chimurenga? Positively, yes. Cheap labor was obtained from Matebeleland and Mashonaland. They appropriated more land and cattle. They now had more revenue base, and even security was enhanced, and the settlers were also united. But the negative effects of the results to the whites include they were condemned worldwide kuti zvamakaita zvikurova vanhu muchiita sei, because Berlin Conference yanga iine kamwe kadiplomacy kake kuti of course munogona kunga muchida kutora nyika yevanhu, but you should take it in a more respectful way. But my whites, they were so brutal, the British were so brutal, they were even condemned internationally for abusing human rights, So they were blamed for various acts of oppression, and hatred between blacks and whites intensified. That's why you find out that it even stretched in the culmination of the second Chimurenga. Ma blacks akatotsama west, havana kufara nazo. And the BISAC shares also dropped. That's why I go not to BISAC ainozombotonga kusvika sterek. I think kuna 1923 zvinenge vanenge vangatovapo pakutopinda uri system. And the Rhodes image was tarnished. And at the end of the day, the Africans wanted what? Revenge. Yes. That's why we revenged via the what? The second Chimurenga. So this is what we are going to look into from tomorrow. Tomorrow it's an exercise. So Monday we'll be starting with the second Chimurenga.